What does legacy mean to you? For over a century, this family of independent whisky makers has founded some of Scotland's most important distilleries, pushed the boundaries of maturation, and played a pivotal role in building Scotch whisky's global reputation. All the while, they've laid down private casks for the next generation to enjoy, and built what's been described as the greatest collection of old and rare whiskies on earth. Personal stocks that have now been made available for connoisseurs to enjoy. This year, they're inviting a select few to join them on a 4-decades-long journey that will see one of their oldest and rarest spirits develop into an exceptional 100-year-old whisky. This is House of Hazelwood's One for the Next. Join me, Christopher Coates, as I travel to the heart of Speyside to meet the people who know this story best. Together, we'll discover the unique heritage behind House of Hazelwood, explore what it means to safeguard the legacy of Scotland's preeminent whisky family, and unveil the bold plan to craft a dram a century in the making. I've just arrived at Hazelwood House, the Gordon family's private home, which is just outside Dufftown in Speyside. If these walls could talk, they'd tell us an incredible story about arguably the most important family to ever turn their hands to making Scotch whisky. A family that's especially entwined with the history of Speyside. Our focus today is on House of Hazelwood, a bottler created to give connoisseurs the opportunity to taste old and rare whiskies from the Gordon family's private stocks. We've reviewed several of their releases blind over the past 2 years. 6 of their whiskies have taken home our recommended awards, and 2 of them have been named Editor's Choice, Whisky Magazine's highest blind tasting accolade. Something I really love about House of Hazelwood is that, along with their blended Scotch and malt whisky releases, they've done a huge amount of work to shine a light on the quality and complexity of aged grain whisky. And that's exactly what we're going to be focusing on today. In particular, this very special 60-year-old single grain from Girvan, which has been called One for the Next. Now, for a lot of whisky companies, releasing a whisky over 40 years old is a complete pipe dream, but for House of Hazelwood, that's par for the course. Each year they release a whole collection of whiskies aged over 40 years that's named after Charles Gordon, someone you'll be hearing a lot more about very soon. But for this particular whisky, which has been bottled to celebrate Girvan Distillery's 60th anniversary, House of Hazelwood wanted to do something unprecedented. And all I'm going to say is that there is an unexpected twist in this dram's story. So keep watching, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button and leave a comment to let us know what you think. Now, it sounds like our first interviewee has arrived, so let's get going. Archivist Andy Fairgrieve has worked for the Gordons for nearly 25 years. Responsible for maintaining one of Scotland's most important whisky archives, no one is better placed to share insight into the family's long history of whisky making and its impact on the Scotch whisky industry.
Well, the Gordons were a local family from an area not too far from here called the Cabra, and in 1897 Mr. Charles Gordon married into the family of William Grant, the Dufftown distiller. He then joined the company in 1903. He went on to help establish the UK trade for his father-in-law's whisky products, and indeed around the world. So with Charles Gordon setting the scene for, creating a world market, the baton passes to his son, William Grant Gordon, who joined the company in 1921, and he is the father of Charles Gordon, who we have here, and also his brother Sandy. William was very much like his father. He travelled extensively, but unfortunately he passed away in 1953. And that meant he couldn't really put his greater plans for expansion into practice, and that was left to his 2 sons, Charlie and Sandy. One of the things that William did believe in, though, was laying down inventory. Even through the hard years of the 1930s and into the Second World War, he continued to make sure the distilleries were producing as much malt whisky as possible. And this was something that Charlie, who joined the company in 1951, really continued on with his father's work.
Charlie was pivotal to the creation of Girvan Distillery in 1963. But what was the lay of the land in the Scotch whisky industry in the 1960s, and why did Charlie feel the need to build Girvan?
Well, I've brought along this newspaper cutting, which kind of illustrates the state of play America was certainly a dominant market, and certainly by the dawn of the 1960s, Charlie was very keen to continue expanding the growth in the brands that he was responsible for. I mean, he had great supplies of malts, but they relied on other people for the grain component. The story is that he went to see a rather large producer of grain spirit, and he was going into that meeting wanting to get more grain. His competitor had a different view and in fact was looking to cut the amount of grain, and this was something that Charlie just could not countenance because it would have meant a reduction in these brands, and he felt it was an attack on his firm's independence. Hence, he went off and built his own grain distillery.
And that distillery was Girvan. One of Scotland's 7 traditional, large-scale single-grain distilleries. It was built in a record time of just 9 months in 1963. To better understand the 60-year-old Girvan bottled for one for the next, I'm meeting John Ross, who's worked at Girvan since 1978. Having overseen Girvan's evolution from a mid-century engineering marvel into Scotland's only multi-pressure whisky distillery, John is now a true master of single-grain production.
Grain whisky is a combination of malted barley and unmalted cereal. We typically operate with column distillation, usually a twin column operation, which in the industry we would call the analyzer and the rectifier. The grain whisky tends to be used in blends, a blend being a combination of malt whisky and grain whisky. The grain whisky tends to be used fairly young. However, where possible, if you can find an aged grain whisky, it will be of very, very high quality and very flavoursome.
We've heard how Charles Gordon decided to build Girvan to secure the long-term independence of the business, but conspicuously, we're in Speyside and Girvan is very much not in Speyside. Yeah. So why did he choose that location in Ayrshire?
First of all, we've got to think that we're using a combination of malted barley and unmalted cereal. And back in the 1960s, when Charles built the Girvan Distillery, the unmalted cereal was typically maize. So maize was actually purchased on the high seas by the boatload, typically coming from the USA. So Charles had to locate close to what I would describe as deep water ports to bring the maize in. This is Girvan here. In the 1960s, it was a big fishing town with a big port. The distillery is just to the north of the town. It sits on its own piece of land. One of the main considerations was the fact that there was a readily available, very good water supply in Pinwapo Reservoir. And there's an interesting story re Charles Gordon on this. He negotiated a 30-year deal with the local authority. 1 old penny per 1,000 gallons. So typically we would draw up to 40,000 gallons per hour. So that was a phenomenal deal. And I won't tell you what the cost of water is today, but substantially more than 1 old penny.
I understand that the distillery that was built in 1963, and indeed as it was when you joined the business, is quite different from what's in situ today. What was the production process and the apparatus that was in place at that time?
We had 3 old maize cookers, each of about 8,000 gallons, and the maize would simply be cooked to gelatinise the starch and then placed into the mash tun along with malted barley to allow the conversion process. It was an all grains in process, and you can see the maize gave an absolutely wonderful bright yellow coloured wort. Typically for maize, we would ferment for around 70 hours. The picture you're looking at is the original still, which we would call number 1 distillation apparatus. Very manual in terms of the operation, a lot of reliance on the skills, knowledge and experience of the distillation operator. It was all done by manual hydrometer and spirit tables, and a great deal of emphasis placed on the sensory character.
And I understand that there were a number of updates that were made to the distillery some decades after you joined. How would you compare the spirit style that was produced back in the 1960s and the 1970s to what you produce today?
It's definitely a lost style. Back in the 1960s and 70s, it was much more aromatic, much heavier, but still of fantastic quality. Charles was absolutely instrumental in that. You know, I would sit down with Charles on a regular basis to talk about quality development. But his mantra to me was always, do what we do, but do it exceptionally well. And that has stuck with me for 47 years.
So we've heard from Andy and John about how each generation of the Gordons has sought to pass on a legacy that was bigger and better and more interesting than the one that was passed to them. Girvan is this marvel of mid-century engineering, and the whiskey that's been created for One for the Next is in many ways this lost style of single grain from a bygone era. Now, like all of House of Hazelwood's whiskies, this single grain was created by blender Ailey Muir. To make One for the Next, she vatted a small parcel of incredibly scarce 60-year-old Girvan that had been filled into American oak casks in 1964, which means this is a 1964 vintage. But all this talk has been thirsty work, so I think it's about time that I tasted it. On the nose, there are these beautiful notes that I would expect from old grain, like toffee and pie crust and soft brown sugar. But underneath, there's this leafy vibrancy. There are these sweet confectionery notes in there too that kind of put me in mind of cassata, a Sicilian cake with ricotta, marzipan, and candied fruits. Particularly, there's a real candied citrus peel note to the nose. Wow, it's so vibrant. There's this intense citrus zing straight off the bat that kind of reminds me of like a yuzu and apple highball. And then as that fades, there are these lovely creamy notes that emerge. It's incredibly complex and absolutely delicious. But I told you that this whiskey story didn't end here. After this small parcel of casks was vatted together, only 25 decanters worth of whiskey were drawn off for bottling. The rest has been filled into a custom coopered European oak hogshead made from this European oak. And this cask will be left to mature for another 40 years. Yeah, you heard that right, 40 years. And every 10 years, 25 more bottles will be drawn from the casks for bottlings at 70, 80, 90, and 100 years old. And each time, the 25 people who've added this whiskey to their collection will be invited to add the next whiskey to their collection too, forging a 40-year connection between their families and the Gordons of Hazelwood House. But of course, this isn't going to be easy. There's a reason there are no 100-year-old whiskies yet, and the next two people that I'm going to meet have been tasked with creating the cask that will hold this whiskey for the next 40 years and then safeguarding it for all that time. So let's go and meet them. Cooper Ian MacDonald and warehouseman George Carrale are two masters of oak and maturation. Drawing on skills passed down the generations, they ensure House of Hazelwood's exceptionally rare stocks develop slowly and safely, building in complexity with each passing year. A cooper for the Gordon family since beginning his apprenticeship in 1969, Ian's decades of experience make him the perfect person to explain the process of crafting a cask fit to hold the Girvan spirit for the next 40 years.
The key components to a barrel, basically three parts: the ends, the staves and the hoops. Along with that you need the reeds and a bung. For raising a barrel, you would take the bundle of staves into your bench and you would examine the staves first, make sure there's no damaged ones. You have a certain size of a hoop which we call a raising hoop or a building hoop. You fill the hoop with the staves and that determines again the quantity the barrel's going to hold. We don't use nail or glue to keep it together, it's just the tightness of a hoop. A bigger hoop, which is called a truss hoop, a heavy hoop, it goes down the middle of the cask. Hammer it tight, then you put on a bilge hoop, which is the lowest of the three hoops. Then you level off the top of the staves, because at the top stave there's a groove called the crows. You tighten hoops, turn it around and close it up on the other side. Next, you measure the circumference to get the size of your end. Then you slip in your end, insert a reed in between the end and the staves into the crows. Turn it around to the same other end. Then once it's past the quality control, then it goes to the warehouse.
The 60-year-old Girvan that's been chosen for One for the Next is being refilled into a custom coopered refilled European oak hogshead. What was the rationale behind choosing that type of cask?
The reason they went for a European cask is because the thickness of the stave. It's obviously been a sherry butt for a start. We've cut the staves down to a certain length. Then we've coopered it. The European oak, they're a lot thicker than the American oak. The American oak dump staves are maybe 25 mil, whereas the Sherry European casks are 35mm. With experience, we've found out that the thicker the wood, the less losses we have, and it's better maturation qualities as well. And because it's a refill, you're going to get the subtle flavours. You're not going to get the full-on maturation. So you just want the subtle flavour from the wood.
With the whisky now refilled into the custom coopered cask, the baton now passes to George Corrale, the custodian of House of Hazelwood's traditional dunnage warehousing.
Personally, for me, my favourite type of warehouse that we have here is the dunnage warehouse. So it's much more atmospheric. I'm quite drawn to the old traditional values, and we're so blessed with like machinery and everything doing the work for us, but back then it was all graft.
I've heard from a lot of people that if you take two identical casks and put them in different places in the same warehouse, you'll end up having those casks develop differently. So how did you choose the location that the one for the next cask is going to rest in for the next 40 years?
So it's going to be on the ground rails at the bottom level of the warehouse. This area is nice and cool, the temperature will be consistent humidity. There'll be no need for it to have any interactions other than just to have a look and check that it's sleeping well. So it should make for a good maturation.
During the maturation process, what do you have to be conscious of when you're maturing such an old liquid for such a long time?
The things we will look on when we're checking the cask, that initially there is no leaks. You can check, you see that by the ground or the ends of the cask. 2, that the hoops are still strong in place. Every now and again, the malt master will ask us to draw a sample from the cask. So by drawing the sample, we can tell that the ABV is still consistent where we want it to be, and it's not dropping below that 40 ABV. And the malt masters get to see how the liquid is progressing.
You're responsible for looking after all of the oldest and rarest whiskey that the Gordon family owns. How does that feel, being responsible for that legacy?
Yeah, no pressure, eh? But yeah, it's a privilege and an honour to be working on the Hazelwood liquids. Every day it's something different. You never know what you're going to be working on next. And I was very lucky with the guys that had been here for a long time, and they passed down their skills and tips to me. And I've taken that, and hopefully I've kind of improved the process. So later on down the future, I'll be able to hand my knowledge to somebody else.
I spent well over a decade writing about whiskey, and quite a bit longer than that enjoying whiskey. And One for the Next is unlike anything I've ever come across before. This could really only be achieved by the Gordon family and House of Hazelwood, and it feels very true to their forward-thinking, pioneering ethos. What I love most about One for the Next is that it's the antithesis of the flipping mentality. This isn't about buying a rare whiskey to sell on in a couple of years. This is an opportunity for people who genuinely love whiskey to have a connection to the Gordon family that will potentially go on past their own time on this earth, allowing the next generations of their own family to build a personal connection to Speyside, to Hazelwood House, and to the Gordons, and to make memories of a whiskey experience like no other. As for the next instalments of One for the Next, we're just going to have to wait. So I guess I'll see you back here in 10 years. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the film. Please leave us a comment and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel.